I'm going to, if I'm talking, feel free to interrupt and ask me questions. Chances are I will get to it in a future slide, but I will have a chance to answer questions at the end of the second presentation. So I'm actually giving two presentations today, and like in your website, they're out of order. I decided to go with them in chronological time for me, as opposed to how they were listed on the website. So we're going to talk about the Archaic period first, and then talk about mining camps. But both of these talks actually come out of archaeological projects by the Office of Archaeological Studies in 2011. And I had the opportunity to direct one of these projects and co-direct the other project. So I'm going to be, all of the talk I'm going to talk about today, or all the presentation I'm going to talk about today, has been reported in two very large technical reports. One's a multi-volume series, the other is a single volume, but these are available online. So if you're interested in learning more about these projects, you can get a hold of me. The publications are free of charge, and I'm pretty much going to be giving, in essence, a summary with the conclusions of what the archaeological research came from. In this case, we're looking specifically at projects that occurred in the area in and around Deming. One that occurred just north of Deming along the highway, and the other which occurred northeast of Deming in what is known as the Cook's Range. So without further ado, I'm going to start. I'm going to minimize my bar. It will not let me minimize my bar. Okay, we're just going to go like this. My first talk is on the Archaic along the Mimbres River. It's known as corn and cotton. I see why. Bear in mind with me. Okay. The project in particular along the Mimbres River was conducted in 2011, as I said, by the Office of Archaeological Studies. This project was contracted with the New Mexico Department of Transportation along the New Mexico 26 and US 180 interchange, just north of Deming, New Mexico. Robert Della Russo served as the principal investigator, with fieldwork supervisors being myself and Stephen Lentz, along with a supporting cast of archaeologists, some of you which you may have heard of in dealing with archaeology in New Mexico, including Rick Montoya, Isaac Cohen, Donald Tatum, Mary Wiaki, Gavin Bird, and Vernon Foster. And the final report, which is available online, was published in 2015 and was designated Archaeology Note 456. And it's available at the link you see there. All right, let's move forward. So the project in particular that was done for the Department of Transportation recorded a site known as LA 159879. I know that is a mouthful as far as names go. If you don't already know, LA stands for Laboratory of Anthropology. And the number you see behind that is the number of archaeological sites recorded before this one. So, for example, there are 1 through 159, 878 archaeological sites before this one was recorded and filed in arms. Minimize this. The site was very large, approximately 320 meters north-south by 80 meters east-west. And you'll notice it's located right along US 180 in what was the ancestral Mimbres River floodplain, approximately half a mile north of the river's current course. Given that the site was occupied over a large period of time, the river may have shifted from where it is now to where it was when the site was occupied. So it may have been closer, it may have been further away. But ultimately, when we recorded this site and did the excavations of this site, it resulted in the documentation of 25 features and the collection of over 2,000 artifacts. Features were found in a light, a loose sand, or in the harder compacted caliche soil beneath. Of the 25 features documented, 21 were determined to be cultural. The other 4 were natural, primarily either burn or rodent features. associated with wildfires. The 21 cultural features included 12 thermal features or hearths and 9 architectural features. Those included everything from post holes to small wiki-ups. And in fact, if you look on the photo you see on the right-hand side, the smaller hole that you see in the foreground, or smaller depression you see in the foreground, is a hearth excavated into the caliche, and the larger depression to the north of there is the small wiki-up that was likely occupied by an archaic person. So his fire pit was outside his little wiki-up for sleeping. Thermal features could also represent as clusters of fire-cracked rock. And you can see that on the left-hand side with feature 10. Sometimes they're all you could see left. There's no charcoal at all. All that's left is the fire-cracked rock, as you can see it in the image. There were at least 3 of those small wiki-up-like structures found on the site, and there may have been more. These are very ephemeral, and they don't always preserve very well in the archaeological record. All right, let me move on to the next slide. Oh, it doesn't like that. There it goes. We did get radiocarbon dates out of the site, and we ran all of those dates, and you can see the results here. You'll notice that there is pretty much 2 periods of discrete occupation. However, those periods both represent palimpsests in that the radiocarbon dates don't necessarily overlap in all the cases. So what you're seeing is 2 primary periods of occupation, but even during that time, the site wasn't occupied as a large whole, but rather people kept coming back to the site over and over again during that period. And those 2 periods in which human occupation appeared to have occurred at the site was a time period the first was known as the late archaic or early agricultural period, from about 2500 BC to AD 400. And the other was the proto or early historic period with human occupation dating from around 1450 to 1700. And you'll notice how those dates cluster. If you look on your left-hand side, you have a very discrete cluster associated with the late archaic. And then on the right-hand side, you have a small cluster associated with the proto-historic. Now, there is some overlap with the bulk of occupation at the site occurring for about 80 years between about 864 and 788 BC. So the majority of features occur within that time. So while there is a substantial amount of overlap, it really isn't through that whole period. It's a much more discrete time period. Whereas the 2 proto-historic or early historic dates really occur in either the 16th or 17th century, very clearly. It should be noted that both groups probably represent primarily hunters and gatherers living in the area. Now, the majority of artifacts associated with these sites and these dates were flakestone tools or flakestone, some of which were tools. Approximately about of the 2,000 artifacts, 1,400 were flakestone with undifferentiated chert serving as the most common material. Undifferentiated chert is just a generic way of saying it's a chert. We don't have a name for it. And tools suggested a broad range of activities occurring at the site, including core reduction, biface reduction, hunting, shaft refurbishing, leather working, woodworking, chopping, and pounding. What that means is that this wasn't a specific sort of short-term camp or stop during a hunting trip. This was a place where people hung out for a little bit and did a whole bunch of different activities. There were a number of projectile points found at the site, including San Pedro points, Pelona points, Waco points, and Bajada points, or possible Bajada point. It should note that the Bajada point dates way earlier than the time period in which we believe the site was occupied, and probably represents something somebody either collected from elsewhere and brought in as a curio, or was using in some fashion or another, perhaps not as it was originally intended on the site. There was also a number of groundstone artifacts. Most of these groundstone artifacts were manos and metates. represented with processing grains, but there were also abraders, pestles, and mortars. Most of the ground stone, which is what you'd expect for the late Archaic, early agricultural period, was relatively small and portable. This is not a time period in which people are necessarily wed to a specific area like later time periods, such as classic Mimbres, for example. Instead, these people are moving around quite a bit on the landscape, and their ground stone is pretty portable too. The most unusual artifact found on the site is actually featured here. It's a small stone ball, approximately 3 centimeters in diameter, and adorned with deeply etched striations. Drilled into its base was a 2 centimeter wide, 2 centimeter deep cavity, possibly allowing it to be attached to a staff or a club. So this may have been some sort of stone that that sat on a stick. Do I think it was a maul? No, I don't absolutely think it was a maul, but it certainly was something of interest. And those striations on it are pretty interesting, though they don't form a pattern. You can kind of see those in the left-hand picture of the ground stone. We also conducted a number of botanical studies, including macrobotanical analysis, flotation samples, pollen analysis, and phytolith analysis. 2 domesticated species were identified on the site. The first was corn, and the latter was cotton. Both were dated, both the corn and the cotton were dated to the late Archaic period and are associated with that earlier habitation of the site. In addition, there was a broad array of wild edible plant species, including amaranth, saltbush, goosefoot, walnut, ricegrass, dropseed grass, purslane, and mesquite. These could have been associated with both historic and archaic peoples or mixed in from modern day contaminants, though it's very likely they were processing the mesquite in some of the other wild plants that we see in the area today too. We also had a number of fauna. The only identified species, though, most of the bones were very, very small and not able to be identified. Those that could be included cottontail, desert cottontail, and jackrabbit, the black-tailed jackrabbit, both of which you can see here, as well as fragments of a turtle, ornate box turtle. All 3 animals are easily acquired in the immediate vicinity of the site. So these are not animals, they're not going out far as like a hunting camp or anything of that nature. These are all things that could just be acquired while doing other tasks in the immediate vicinity. Based upon these materials, collectively, we have limited, based upon the limited architectural evidence, absence of storage features, an array of artifacts found, LA 159879 likely served as a seasonal camp focused on the exploitation of wild plant resources growing in and around the Mimbres River. The fauna presumably represent species that were encountered, not targeted. The presence of the box turtle, along with the range of plant resources, indicates an occupation during the monsoon season, approximately between June 15th and September 30th. So what we are saying is that based upon the materials that we found in the area, we think that the site's a palimpsest of people returning year after year after year. What they're returning is they're returning seasonally to this area during the monsoon season to take advantage of these wild plant resources, as well as maybe some small bits of opportunistic agriculture. Both the corn and the cotton present in late Archaic contests dating the 9th century BC. While corn has been clearly dated to this time elsewhere, LA, all 6 of those numbers, which are not that important at this time, has been or was in 2011. I have not seen anything new in the literature since then, the earliest of evidence of cotton in the American Southwest. Now, to be clear, while it is the earliest dated cotton in the American Southwest, it is probably not the first cotton in the American Southwest. It just happens to be the place that has yielded the earliest date. I know archaeologists love to have the earliest dates on things. I don't really care, and nor do I think it's that important. I think if it was there, it was elsewhere in the American Southwest during that time. But it's cool to be able to push it back to cotton production back to the the early Archaic. These materials, both cotton and corn, would have been intentionally planted in the area, perhaps not cared for year round. Instead, they appear to be utilized as a risk management strategy to supplement what could be reliably gathered. So what you probably did every year is you knew you were going to come through this area in the monsoon season. You would, throw some corn seeds on the floodplain. And, when you got there in the monsoon season, if the corn had grown and the cotton had grown, that's great. You exploited it. If it hadn't, you focused on the wild resources. This is not a permanent village by any stretch of the imagination. These habitation structures are very, very ephemeral. These hearths are not well planned or well laid out. This is a very quick down and dirty. I'm there for at most a couple months. I gather what I can in the area and I move on kind of strategy. It's also important to note that LA 159879 is not a single instance of time. It's a palimpsest of people returning to the same site to perform the same activities repeated during the late Archaic period. And while most of these activities occurred in the 9th century BC, features dated throughout the broader period from about 1050 to 429 BC. In fact, this will show you just how ephemeral those features are. If you'll notice in these pictures here, these are both thermal features. And if you'll notice, especially on the lower left one, you'll notice that the soil is a little bit darker in that half circle feature 9 than the surrounding soil. That's the only indication we had there that there had been a hearth in that area. So pretty ephemeral stuff. Okay. Later proto-historic, somebody has something in chat. What did the cotton look like? Also, can you also define the terms used, pointed tools, arrowhead types? This is from Camilla Berry. So the cotton was a seed. This is a little black burn seed. I think it was actually recovered from a pollen sample in the site, but it was actually a macro botanical, if you can call that macro botanical. It's a very, very small seed of cotton. In fact, I had somebody ask me the question one time if we think they were processing the seeds to eat. And because I guess you can eat cotton seeds, and perhaps they were. More likely, I think they were trying to gather the cotton, the actual cotton material, but I don't necessarily know that. As far as projectile points types, let's move back a little bit. I'm not going to be able to give you a lesson in all the projectile points of the late Archaic, but let me see if I can move back a little bit. Oh, it won't let me go back. Hold on. So, these are some of the projectile points found in the area. Now, I am not necessarily the greatest of. Somebody told me you can eat cotton seeds. The plant didn't look like anything we found. All we found was a little seed. The cotton plants are about less than a foot tall in the American Southwest. They're really small. But somebody told me you can eat the cotton seeds, but I think they were processing it just for the cotton, man. So I don't think the cotton seeds were necessarily the main draw of what they were doing there. Just happens to be some ancillary evidence of perhaps some collection of cotton. But here is the projectile points that you see from the area. Some of these projectile points actually look such as the Bahada point in the lower left. Look very, very similar to projectile points you find even in the Taos area associated with in that case, the early Archaic. By the time you get into the late Archaic, you're seeing some more definitive styles associated with southern New Mexico, those primarily being the San Pedro and Pelona points. Those are those, I guess you call them shoulder notched projectile points, some of which you can see in the northern part of the top part of the screen. The reality is, to be clear, projectile points is less of a hard science than you would think. If you were working in a different part of the state, you might use different terminology to represent these projectile points. And there was a lot of other stone tools found on the site as well, such as scrapers and things of that nature. I'm thinking all or two as well, which is why we have leatherworking listed. In fact, that figure F in the upper slide is a possible drill. Okay. Let me see if I can move my slides back up to where I was. Those are good questions, though. People get caught up on the cotton all the time. I wouldn't necessarily, I know I use it in the title because people like cotton. I don't think these people are any different from anybody else living along the Mimbres River during this time period, which is where I'm going. Okay. Now, interestingly enough, while you do have these discrete proto-historic peoples on the site, their activities are identical to the Archaic period. In fact, if we had not run chronometric samples, i.e. C14 dating, we would have never known that there were proto-historic peoples on the site. We just assumed it was all late Archaic, early agricultural period. And so that's a problem if only limited chronometric data exists. If we had only sent in 2 samples and those had come back as both being archaic, we've assumed the site dated to the Archaic period. So it was important that we ran quite a few samples for this project. Okay, so what are some of our conclusions? Well, overall, LA 159. I remember I'm going to give a different talk in a few minutes, so you're not getting the end of me. This is just part 1 of 2. You got me for another 30 minutes, guys. But overall, LA 159879 falls within the expected norms of archaeological sites typically associated with the late Archaic period. A mobile hunter and gatherer group or groups returned to the site repeatedly to focus on the collection and processing of wild plants along the Mimbres River during the monsoon season. The presence of early cotton is unique, but agriculture was certainly established in the Southwest by the 9th century BC, the Southwest New Mexico in particular. And in many locations, it was much more developed. So I want to make that clear. These are primarily hunters and gatherers that do a little farming on the side. There were more active areas for more intense farming during this period, just not along this portion of the Mimbres River. Later proto-historic and historic period hunter and gatherer groups also occupied the site. However, the presence would have gone unrecognized if not for radiocarbon dating. If you'd like to learn more about this project, you can download the report online. It's available online at nmarchaeology.org. It's Archaeology Note 456, and it was actually published in 2015. So you can learn a lot more about the site. If the Archaic period really speaks to you, this is a great period, a great set of data with which to just kind of get your feet wet, because in many ways, the most amazing thing about LA 159879 is that it's unamazing. It actually is a great example of what you should find and what you do find when you're dealing with late Archaic, early agricultural period sites in the Mimbres Bolso. All right, and there's me standing in the desert. That's where we dug. All right, I'm going to go on to my next slideshow. So I'm going to stop this one. Go on to the next one. So I said I did 2 projects. So that summer, I was digging the Archaic period site. But as that summer came to an end, I shifted to a different project. In fact, my wife hates me for this because I was actually gone almost the entire first year of my twins' lives, or well, about from when they were about from half a year old all the way to 1.5 years old. I was gone and working down in Deming, as opposed to being around my wife in Bernalillo during this time period. The second project I did as summer turned to fall was a survey by the Abandoned Mines Bureau of the Cooks Peak Mining District. If you didn't know, taxes on coal in the United States help pay to close abandoned mines, to protect people from falling in the mines, to protect wildlife, to deal with toxic cleanup and stuff like that. A tax from coal, a tax is put on coal, and that tax helps pay for treating these abandoned mines. One of the first things you have to do before you can treat these landscapes is treat them as archaeological and historical resources. And so my next project, I gave up on the archaic, or moved off from the archaic before I even had a chance to analyze what we had in the archaic period project. I moved off into the mountains. Let me move forward on my slides. The Cook's Range, you can see it from a long ways away. In fact, you've probably seen it and drove by it and just never known it was there. It's very clear from I-10. I'm actually taking a picture from the north end of the range looking south. Cook's Range is located in Luna County, New Mexico, northeast of Deming, and is dominated by a single large peak known as Cook's Peak. That tip of that peak, which you can see here on the horizon, is 8,400 feet in height, and the mountain range itself includes a mix of igneous, metamorphic, and sedimentary rocks. In fact, interestingly enough, I said there was protohistoric people down on the Mimbres floodplain, which you can kind of see on the far right-hand side in that valley down below. So where I'm standing there is a protohistoric site on quartzite rim. Perhaps the same people who habitated that ridgeline would go down seasonally into that floodplain to collect those wild resources. Same time period, same contemporaneous, but we're going to talk primarily about the miners now. All right. So minerals in Cook's Range. Well, thanks to a lot of uplifting and erosion, you get an ore body at or near the present day ground surface, which means that you can walk up to areas of the landscape where you can see mineral ore just sticking out of the ground. Kind of looks like the stuff you see here, though that's been mined by the miners, of course. As a result, the mineral deposits are easily detectable and exploitable. You don't have to be a rocket scientist or even a professional miner to mine in the Cook's Range, which is going to be a focus as to where we'll go with this talk. And mining focused primarily on lead, zinc, and silver. However, gold, copper, and fluorite were extracted from various areas of the range. The Cook's Peak Mining District was the most productive in Luna County, with more than $4 million in lead, zinc, copper, silver, and gold produced between 1876 and 1965. That's by numbers for the day, not modern day equivalents, by the way. The Cook's Peak Mining District, as far from a historic perspective, the ore bodies were discovered in 1876 by a rancher and prospector by the name of Edward Orr. And the area collectively became known as Cook's Peak Mining District by 1890. The district's divided into multiple sub-districts, including 3 major mining camps, including Cookstown, Hadleytown, and Josetown. This is a good example of an adit leading into the mine. If you'll notice, the front end of the adit is completely collapsed, so the door that used to prevent access to the thing is now actually further back. You can actually just climb over it and climb right into the mine itself, which is why these things need to be closed and stabilized so people don't go back in there and mess around. The oldest of the 3 towns that were built in the Cook's Peak mining industry, the oldest was Cookstown. It dated, its heyday was from about 1882 to 1927. You can see a picture of some of the town here on the mountainside in this historic photograph. It's located in the northeast corner of the range over by, if you're going towards Nut, New Mexico. It had as many as 30 permanent residences, which was a lot for a mining camp of this type. Now, coal mining camps are a different matter entirely, but as far as a silver mining camp, that was a lot of permanent structures. Most of the structures were actually tents, and you can actually see some of those on the mountainside. So if you look out and you see some white structures kind of in the upper right side of the photograph, those white structures represent camping tents. There was 30 permanent residences, including numerous commercial businesses, including a reported 16 saloons at Cookstown. However, there was no church, but it did have a schoolhouse. I don't know what building we see in that picture, if it's in there, what the schoolhouse was. Schoolhouse might have just been a tent. but you get some ideas to what the community looked like in this photograph. Here's some pictures of what Cookstown looks like today. So very ephemeral rubble, kind of on the side of the mountainside. As you get up closer, some of the stone walls are still standing in some places. You do have some older materials that have been stripped out, still laying where they had fallen defunct, as well as open shafts that go hundreds of feet into the mountainside, which is what you see in the right-hand slide. The second mining camp in Cooks Peak was Hadley Town. This camp had its heyday from about 1880 to 1929, pretty much closing in 1943. It was named after Walter C. Hadley, miner and prospector, which helped found the nearby Lake Valley, which is just north of Nutt. You can actually visit Lake Valley today. Hadley Town was located on the east side of the range, and the community centered around the graphic mine, which you see here in the foreground. This is the graphic mine, though you can see some residential buildings off to the side if you look closely in the pictures. This town actually had a post office, 5 saloons, 2 female places, which are exactly what you think they are, and a general store. So a fairly robust community in and of itself. As we look at what Hadley Town looks like today, here you can see the graphic mine in the distance. Those spoils you see, those yellow piles, are actually the spoils from the mine. Here in that's the upper left photo, and the lower right photo, you'll see a car, but also you'll see a small retaining wall making a flat area. That's a flat area, primarily, possibly, most likely for a tent pad. So when I said there aren't a lot of permanent structures in these mining communities, normally what you'll have is these retaining walls to create these flat areas to put a tent on. You can also see an old car in the background. I don't know why. It just pictures of the desert with old cars in them really appeals to me. You can also see some standing structures. Here we have a small structure located in near the graphic mine, as well as a shaft going straight into the mountainside. This shaft is associated with the graphic mine. You'll notice the little ladder to get human beings up and down. I know we like to think that these things had great, massive engineering works associated with them, but not always the case. Sometimes it's just a little ladder. Somebody asked something in the chat. Are there roads leading to the camps? Yes, there are. There are very terrible roads leading to the camps. And most of these camps are on public land. There are portions of the Hyatt Ranch, which include, especially around here with the Hadley Town, are on private land. The only one that's not accessible via public road is Jose Town, which we'll get to in a minute. And that was a question from Camilla Berry. So yes, these are on, most of the stuff that I'm showing you right now is on public land. The last one we don't have a historic photo of. The last town was Jose Town. It was actually on the northwest corner of the range. We do have some plats of some of the mines, including the Gladys lode, which you'll see here. Interestingly, this town went from about 1880 to 1937. It was originally named Raphael. Then it was named Jose, after the name Alma was already taken. So they actually went for Raphael, then decided it should be Alma, but when Alma was taken, they chose Jose. According to the historic record, a description of the town past its heyday mentioned that it was only a few old shacks, one of which had served as a post office for 3 years. As I said, it contained mines such as the Gladys mine, which is platted. So we do have some information on Gladys and how big Gladys was. And we have some knowledge of how much silver came out of Gladys. This is what Jose Town looks like today. Looks like very barren on the mountainside. You wouldn't even necessarily know there had been a town there. However, you can see one of the shafts going down into Gladys in the picture in the lower right. I did take a picture of one of the shacks. This shack here was the most robust of the shacks that we found disintegrate on the mountainside. So I want to guess that this probably was the post office, but we don't know that for sure. We also had some ore cart rail put in at Jose Town. If you'll notice, we're standing on the side of the mountain and we're looking straight down thousands and thousands of feet. And that area you see below you, that flat area, is the Mimbres Bolson, the ancestral Mimbres floodplain, which we were closer to the river when we were doing that other archaeological site. But you can see that down below is where that other archaeological site was. All right. So one of the things we did is we performed a survey. So we tried to document all the structures, all the mines, all the trash dumps we could find in the mining district. And so we collect a lot of data, but it is an intense archaeological research. It's primarily locating the size, shape, and some basic information about these materials. And so what do we learn from documenting all of this stuff in the Cook's Range? Well, first of all, mining, the characterization of mining as a whole, it was widespread. We know 20 tons of ore were removed from the Cook's Range between 1904 and 1943 alone. And that was past the prime years in the late 19th century. So 20 tons of ore were removed when things weren't going good. We also had some evidence, small scale, limited use of rail systems and cribbing. What that means is that most of the mines did not have rail systems or cribbing. Cribbing is what you use to keep the mine from collapsing in on you. They didn't do a lot of that. Moreover, most of the mines, and we're talking thousands here, I want to make clear that we're talking thousands of mines, are less than 12 feet deep. Now, the Abandoned Mine Bureau, we have some feature designations we use with the Abandoned Mine Bureau of what represents a prospect pit. These pits classified as deeper than prospect pits, but only barely so. Most of it is very, very little. It's just digging a small hole into the mountainside. So what does all this say about the people who mined in the Cook's Range? First of all, that they had limited knowledge of mining. There was no formal planning of the mines or towns, and only a handful of claims were patented. To put this in contrast, a company coal mining town is planned out to the nitty gritty, exactly where you put the mines, how you develop the mines, how the houses look. Everything's built the same way and purposely built in a formalized pattern. This is none of that. This is just go with whatever you think you have. In fact, there was places on the mountainside where it looked like guys had just blasted chunks of dynamite, blasted holes into the mountain until they tried to, just looking for something, just randomly blasting in areas just to figure out if they could find something. Not very skilled and very, very dangerous. We do have some historical records about just how dangerous these mines were. In fact, or how ephemeral these mines were. Now, the picture you see here shows an ore cart railway. And these are the kind of photos you find in the historical record. However, while this is great, and if you just read, looked at the pictures and read this, some of the historical record, you'd go, wow, it's like mining everywhere else. They're doing mining like you see in all the movies. But that's not necessarily what was going on. And this is a fascinating quote from Murdy McDaniel Moore, who was a granddaughter of one of the founders of the mines. She describes what actual working conditions were like. And she says this: there were as many as 1,000 men working in the mines at one time. Most of the workers before the turn of the century were from a tribe of Indians in Mexico. These Indians were employed mostly as ore carriers. A bag with a 50-pound capacity was held on their back by a strap across their forehead. Carrying this load in such an awkward way, the men would walk through the tunnels and up the primitive ladders at the mine entrance, deposit the burden, and go back for another load. A few years later, tracks were laid through the mine, and one man could push a cart containing 200 pounds of ore. this is the well, this is, I think, the George family here. Actually, McDaniel and George are featured in here. Unfortunately, this is not a great family photo. The gentleman with the hat on in the left-hand side, he gets shot for abusing his wife, probably by his wife. So who were the mine owners of Cook's Peak? Most were identified through mining claims and homestead patents. So we were able to tell who the owners of the Cook's Peak were. The most prominent mine owners included Elizon Orr, who was that first guy who founded the area, Upton McDaniel, who's pictured on the left-hand side, Riley George, Charles Poe, Edwin Hyatt, and A.P. Taylor. Most have no background in mining. McDaniel was initially the postmaster at nearby Fort Cummings. He owned 25 mines, or staked or made claims on 25 mines. George controlled 9 mines, and his main claim to fame was not that he controlled mines, but that he controlled the only drinkable spring of water in the Cook's Range. So pretty much everybody had to buy water from him. Poe owned the general store and controlled 15 mines. And Hyatt, whose family is still there today, was a rancher, and he owned 10 claims. The populations of Cook's Peak at various times, and we can see that. I think I've got another picture up close in the next slide, but you can see some of that donkey train that carried the water up in the front of the general store here. The population of Cook Range fluctuated from hundreds to thousands of peoples, and most of the population was seasonal and depended upon the price of silver. There was no documentation of Cook's Peak or in Cookstown in the 1880 census. And unfortunately, the 1890 census, which would have provided numbers at the height of occupation, no longer exists. So we do not have the census records for the height of when people would have been living at Cookstown and at Josetown and so on and so forth. Interestingly, the 1900 census records only 343 people living at Cookstown. Still, as much as Cook's Lake Valley is touted as being one of the great producers of silver, it's important to note that in 1900, more people lived at Cookstown than at nearby Lake Valley. So 343 might not seem like a lot, but it was still bigger than most other silver mining towns in New Mexico. Now, interestingly, the fun thing we can do with this 1900 record is we can start to look at where these people are actually from. And this was a fascinating thing we were able to do in the historic research, because I said most of them, according to Murray McDaniel, actually were from Indians from a tribe in Mexico, right? Well, we can't get to that kind of detail in the census record, but we can look and say that over half were either born in Mexico or born in the U.S. to Mexican nationals, i.e. not native-born New Mexican Hispanics. So the census record appears to collaborate what Murray said about the people working at Cookstown prior to the 20th century. In fact, the most common surnames were Rodriguez, Guardia, Delgado, Hasso, and Gutierrez. That's a far cry from the people who owned the mines. Most people who lived there were of Mexican descent or recent Mexican labor brought in. You could comment that perhaps as much as things changed, they stayed the same. Largely, people from south of the border were taking these hard, dangerous jobs that no American wanted. Yes, and that is a little bit of political commentary. Camilla Berry says, great research on the names. I thought so. You know, you find something always to try to do different with each project. And I felt very confident, you know, going into Cook's Peak as far as what I could do with the project and how I could get these stories out there. So what was life in the camps like? Well, here's that water, the water thugs, the only drinkable spring in the Cook's Range. There it is. How do you control people? Well, people need to drink water. And in the American Southwest, especially in the Chihuahuan Desert, there isn't a lot of water. So controlling the only water that isn't poisoned is awesome. And this is how the Riley family or Riley George made his money, was by owning donkeys and traveling with water. Life in the camps. Of the 3 towns, there was 7 brothels and as many as 25 saloons in the towns, but not a single church. Cattle rustling was common based upon some of the accounts we could find, and there was evidence of claim jumping. So even though somebody filed a claim, that doesn't mean those were the people actually working the land. There was reported violence without the repercussion of law enforcement. And interestingly enough, the Cook's Range actually got blizzards in the wintertime and dust storms in the summer. And according to accounts by the people who lived in the towns, they were always fearful of hostile Apaches living in the area or traveling through the area. Those are the descendants of those proto-historic hunters and gatherers that we just dealt with in the last talk. And there's circumstantial evidence of widespread lead poisoning. There's most of the water was tainted. So if you weren't getting it from this source, you probably were drinking from other sources that were tainted with lead, and that was probably not leading to a very good life. And there's some really crazy stories in all mining camps, but certainly some of the violence that was perpetrated by people against their own relatives in the Cook's Range was disturbing, and maybe the result of lead poisoning. I can't say that with any direct authority, just strange stories. So when does the end come for the Cook's Range? Because certainly it's not even a town today, right? It really doesn't end with a bang. It ends with a slow whimper. As the fortunes of the mines kind of turn south, people start to move into nearby Deming, which is becoming a city in its own right. All major mining operations are shut down by 1943, and private land is consolidated into the hands of a few ranching families. In fact, it's important to note that in the Cook's Range, ranching has existed before and after the mining boom. So the ranchers were there before, and the ranchers were after their general. Though we can see a change in ranching throughout the time of the Cook's Range. In the 19th century, the Cook's Range was home to sheep, goat, and cattle. By the mid-20th century, when these mining operations are shutting down, it's all cattle. Now, there are some fanciful stories about why that could be. In fact, one of them is that they sheared the sheep too early and a blizzard came in and wiped out the sheep, and therefore only the cattle were left. And that's how you turn to cattle. But actually, if you look at New Mexico history as a whole, almost everywhere in New Mexico sees that same shift. So, for example, in the 19th century, ranching was a mix of sheep, goat, and cattle. And by the mid-20th century, cattle is king. That's true throughout all of New Mexico. So you don't have to have that just so story to make it work in the case of the Cook's Range. Okay, so what's the legacy of the Cook's Range? First of all, there's 3 very large ghost towns sitting up on that mountainside with thousands of mines. It's a popular rock hounding destination, and prospecting is still ongoing. So, for example, when we look up at the top slide there, you'll notice there's a claim marker sitting there that has spray painted the words RAZ on it. That's a modern day prospector's claim. Are they making a lot of silver and gold? No. However, I can tell you a major company was actually out there while we were doing the survey, and there's still an interest in the waste piles of Cook's Peaks. Now, interestingly, gold and silver mining's advanced a lot since the early 20th century, and nowadays people wouldn't mine the mines. What they would mine are the waste piles, because the amount of silver and gold which can be taken out of waste piles nowadays, if the price of gold and silver gets high enough, they'll just process the waste piles because it becomes profitable to do so. It's also important to note that descendant population still lives in the surrounding area. The Hyatt family, which owned a number of mines, still lives on the Cook's Range. But most of the other families listed in this presentation still live in the nearby town of Deming. But the area as a whole, if you're thinking about, well, I want to go out and see this area, he just showed tons of cool stuff. And I bet you he's got a billion more cool pictures. And I absolutely do. But the area is extremely dangerous. I'd love to say there's signs like this one over every open mine shaft. There's maybe a sign like this over every 1 in 50 mine shafts you see, and only the ones that are closest to the road. If you actually go wandering off into the mountainside, you will encounter things that are really, really bad. And it's not just open mines. There's poisonous waste piles and springs, abandoned explosives, and failing roads. Don't go out there unless you've been there with somebody who knows how to get through there. All right. I think I got one more select. Okay. So these reports might be harder to get hold of. And here we are. This is my crew for the Cooks Peak project. There on left to right, we have Susan Moga, Don Tatum, Mary Wiyaki, Isaiah Cohen with his arms behind his head, and then me, your bald lecturer today behind him. And we're actually sitting at one of the mines in Jose Town, one of the shafts or adits into the mountainside at the Cooks Range. These volumes are available online or may be available online. They may not be as readily available as some of the other project I was just talking about, because these archaeological sites, while documented, still exist on the landscape today, which is also the reason why I did not provide you with any specific maps or locations of any specific things I talked about in this lecture. But with that, I'm going to stop sharing and I will let you guys see my not so beautiful face. And I will, if there are any further questions you have, I will be happy to answer them. You can just unmute yourself and ask them.
Hey, Matt, I was wondering, on survey, did you guys find any children's toys like marbles or doll parts or anything like that?
Yes, not that common, but certainly we did find evidence of women and children in the area. Most of it wasn't as impressive as you might think. I know there's some other projects that I know Phil has worked on in the past where they found lots of evidence of children. That's not necessarily the case in the Cooks Peak. Actually, the more fascinating thing we would come across occasionally is there's several Mimbres sites inside or adjacent to the project area, as well as some large proto-historic sites associated with hunters and gatherers. So occasionally we come across very large sites that were not associated with Anglo-Americans. We did document those as well. However, it was survey, so we did not do any in-depth archaeological investigations of those sites. But the Hyatt family told lots of stories about a member site, which I believe is listed as Hyatt 2. Yes, it's actually named after the rancher family. But how in the early days that you could go out there and find tons and tons of pottery. Nowadays, if you go out there, you see mostly broken Mimbres fragments, not the largest ones that you would necessarily they're not amazing. Also, all this is happening if you like rock art. You're actually, as you're standing on the mountainside there, you're looking down on in the west side, you can actually see Pony Hill's petroglyph site, which is a famous petroglyph site in the area, very close to where it was. Any more questions?
So are most of your statistics coming from Socorro, from the mines? Did they have records on those towns?
They had a little bit, but actually the best, some of the best research actually came from the Mimbres Luna Deming Museum.
Yeah,
They
that's a
actually
good
have,
one.
when you go into that museum, they have tons of everything in that museum. But one of the most fascinating things from a mining perspective is the first room on the left-hand side. If you go into that museum, and I assume it's still like that, I haven't been in a couple of years, has tons and tons of photographs of the mining camp. So most of those photos actually came from the Mimbres Luna Museum. Mark said something in chat. I want to look at it and be able to address it. Mark said, Dave Snow has been very interested in the possible impacts of the dietary use of cottonseed. In July 2018, the message sent by Dave said in part, for example, I've been trying now for some time to find a statement way of determining how hot must a fire temperature be in order to negate the potentially serious effects of consuming plant seeds containing significant amounts of gossypol. So I guess it is poisonous unless it's cooked to a high level. So the key is whether it was eaten as a food or whether it wasn't. And then it, some black women may have used it as a contraceptive. Well, that's there's a whole bunch more in the chat there than I will necessarily need to go into. I don't think, guys, I get it, and people have been very interested in the idea that you consume cottonseed, which I find very strange. I think they were just using it for cotton, guys, but they may have consumed it. Maybe they did. Certainly, they were consuming a lot of other things there. Mesquite requires quite a bit of processing to make it worth your while. As do so most of those grasses, and so it's possible. It's not really where my focus is. Cotton has the most common use of cotton is not as a food item; it's as a clothing item. My assumption would be they were using it for that.
So I want to know from an anthropological and female viewpoint about the guy that was shot and killed. You hinted at that story. I want to know more details.
So I'm not going to remember. So this is the terrible thing. So first off, go get the report and read it, because I'd probably tell the story better in there. I actually thought of the story when I was talking about it, but at any rate, one of them, and I'm not going to remember if it was Poe or McDaniel off the top of my head. Any rate, one of them, who owned the general store, was like potentially beating on his wife. And either his wife shot him in self-defense, or Riley George, who's a young boy in that photograph, shot his stepdad for beating on his mom. I don't know what the truth is. There was a lot of crazy stories like that. There was one about the Hyatts when they were doing their ranching, being very scared the miners were coming in and stealing their cows in the middle of the night. So they were always armed, even when they were just camping on the thing, because they were afraid at any moment the miners, especially as stuff started to turn south for the mines and it stopped being profitable, a lot of the miners would just grab the ranchers' animals and eat them on the mountainside. And so it became a more and more hostile relationship. But it's also important to note that in Hyatt's case, they were not just ranchers, they were the owners of the mine. So those were people who worked for them that were potentially taking advantage of their animals. So it was a very nerve-wracking situation, which it's not to say company coal towns didn't have their own issues. They certainly did. In fact, the Ludlow Massacre is a great example in southeastern Colorado of organized labor and some of the issues you get in company towns. But for Cookstown, which is not a company town in any stretch, it was the wild, wild west. It was literally, you go up there, you dig around, maybe you make it rich, maybe you steal something, maybe you dig on somebody else's claim that's already found silver. It was a terrible existence. And it appears that many of them, especially if you couldn't, here's the beauty of it. If you were making a lot of silver, you probably could afford to get the good water. But if you weren't finding silver, you probably couldn't afford to get water from Riley George, in which case you were probably starting to succumb to lead poisoning. And that could play all sorts of horrible things on you and in your health conditions, but also perhaps in your mental state. So
How fun.
And it's
Deming had 16 passenger trains a day at the peak around 1900 when we were in that same museum doing research. Yeah. Said Deming never really had a boom.
but Deming didn't
16
have to have
passenger trains a day.
I guess what you should say is Deming is, the winner of the race. All these other towns that were so tied to this mining, they ended up falling apart. So
Right.
it's just the way of it goes. There's also, if you end up going out to the Cook's Range, there's also Fort Cummings is just south of the Hadley town, as well as the old, Butterfield stage line went through there as well. So there's other historic events in the area. If you're significant and want to learn more about southwestern New Mexico, hopefully I gave you a great example, though I probably, for all of you, you feel cheated out of what most people think of as the archaeological nexus of southwestern New Mexico, which is classic Mimbres. I managed to go from the early agricultural period, jump to the Pueblo period, and then went all the way to historic mining without talking about perhaps the juiciest period. but perhaps that's a discussion for a different day.
Okay, hey, well, thanks, Matt. Good
Yeah.
to see everybody. December 14th, there'll be another talk. Carrie Levin's gonna talk about archaeology in the Valle Vidal. So instead of our potluck that we normally have, we're gonna have another talk. But we are getting organized to have our ASNM annual meeting in May. So you'll be seeing the registration start back up in December sometime for that. It'll be May 6th through the 8th. And hopefully we'll all be there, and mask or no mask or whatever it takes. We're gonna make it happen. So we'll see you all next time. Thanks for joining us, and December 14th. We'll see you then. Thanks, Matt.
All right, bye, guys.
Good talk.